And she even talks about how several times throughout this period where she says to her dad, hey, Pop, I don't like this house. I don't like what's going on here. I just don't like the vibe. Let's just leave. But her dad is really enamored and in love with the idea of Mulholland Farm. And her dad really likes that he's living in Errol Flynn's old house. So she really feels like she had nowhere to go and kind of felt like she couldn't get her dad out of that situation. Tracy recounts an even more terrifying tale. She said that she was in her bedroom trying to sleep and her dad was entertaining some people downstairs when she feels this immense weight on her chest and she cannot move. It's like she's being pinned down. She can't breathe. She starts panicking, and while she's in this panic state, feeling this heaviness on her chest, she can't move. She hears this laughing. She hears what sounds like a man laughing. He said, it was like meeting a beautiful statue and then coming up close and seeing all the cracks and flaws. There was obviously a great sadness in this man. On the surface, he had everything. Here was an extraordinarily handsome man, an athlete. He had charm, wit, and intelligence. And yet somehow, it didn't all add up to who he really wanted to be. When a man burns himself out by age 50, you have to think there are some great flaws there. There's something wrong. And I couldn't have said it better. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Jennifer. I am so excited to have you here. Today we are starting a brand new book on the channel. It's called Errol Flynn Slept Here. The full title of the book is called Errol Flynn Slept Here, The Flynns, the Hamblins, Rick Nelson, and the Most Notorious House in Hollywood. It's by Robert Mattson and Michael Manzoni. Now you may be asking yourself, Errol Flynn, isn't he old Hollywood, dead and gone, who cares? Let me tell you, if you enjoyed my Joan Crawford series, you will absolutely love this series. Errol Flynn was larger than life in his day. He was the original bona fide Hollywood superstar. We have action heroes nowadays. We've got our heartthrobs. But before there were people like Arnold Schwarzenegger or Clint Eastwood or Sylvester Stallone or heartthrobs like Brad Pitt or Tom Cruise, there was Errol Flynn, and he was all of those things wrapped up into one. He was an action hero. People called him a swashbuckler, a risk taker. He was an adventurer. He was a notorious Hollywood womanizer. And he basically mesmerized an entire generation, literally overnight. He worked for Warner Brothers, and in 1935, they debuted a movie, Captain Blood, and they cast Errol Flynn in that movie. He was a virtual unknown and literally overnight became a sensation. This man just turned Hollywood upside down, and they really knew that they had something special with him. Women were throwing themselves at his feet. Men wanted to be him. He literally was larger than life. And this book takes a look into his life and into the notorious home that he built in the Hollywood Hills, the infamous Mulholland Farm. He had a co-star that was very famous in her own right, Olivia de Havilland, and she starred in 8 films with him. And she said of Earl, and I quote, "It was an instant attraction. I thought he was the most beautiful looking man I had ever seen in my life." And Earl was not without his share of controversy. Yes, he was a larger than life superstar, but he, for example, stood trial for murder in his very early 20s before he even entered Hollywood. He was acquitted, but these are the types of things that I found out about Earl in my research while I was reading this book. At the height of his popularity and in his heyday, he built his famous and some would say infamous home called Mulholland Farm on the top of Mulholland Drive in the San Fernando Mountains overlooking Los Angeles. And this home was his refuge and was his playground. And it was notorious. It was the notorious place for all the Hollywood parties and all the happenings. And I was watching a documentary on Errol Flynn hosted by Christopher Lee the famous Christopher Lee from Lord of the Rings, who himself starred in 4 films with Earl. And Christopher said that one of the least interesting things about Earl was that he was a movie star. And that is so true. The more you learn about Earl, the more you think, actually, being a Hollywood movie star was probably something that he was least proud of. Errol Flynn was born in Tasmania, Australia on June 20th, 1909. And by the time he was 16, he had been kicked out of at least 4 schools in both Australia and England. And by the time he was 20, starting out with almost 0 sailing experience, he had logged almost 2,000 nautical miles sailing around the entire east coast of Australia, all the way to New Guinea. By the time he got to New Guinea, he worked odd jobs. He worked in mining. He was the overseer of a tobacco plantation. Some people say that he was involved in the indentured servant/slave trade in New Guinea. It was there in New Guinea that he stood on trial for murder, of which he was acquitted. And this is all before he reached the age of 25, before he even arrived in Hollywood. When he died at the age of 50 in Vancouver, British Columbia, it was said that he had the body of an 85-year-old because of all the hard living he had done. This man was drinking and he was smoking and he was a known drug abuser. So he was a definite hard partier. He was a published author of 2 books. He actually wrote a screenplay and sold it to Warner Brothers for a few weeks during the Spanish Civil War. He left his movie career, just literally walked off the set of Warner Brothers and decided to go be a war correspondent for the Spanish Civil War, until the head of Warner Brothers, Jack Warner, had to basically call him back and force him back to Hollywood. This man, he was a daredevil and he was just crazy and he just flew by the seat of his pants. And oh yeah, he was actually also following Fidel Castro around when Fidel Castro was the leader of the rebel army in Cuba before they took over. So reading about him, reading about his life, reading about this home that he constructed on the top of a mountain on Mulholland Drive to be his castle, so to speak, and he was going to be the king and rule all. There's just so many stories surrounding Earl. And I have to say, in all that I've read, he definitely was his own worst enemy, because he did such hard living and he took so many risks and lived life to such an extreme. And because he was such a notorious womanizer, he actually was in two statutory rape trials in his lifetime. He was acquitted, but you have to think to yourself, what is going on there? Do you think that you could probably learn from your mistakes? But it doesn't really seem like it. There was a lot of hard drinking. There was a lot of smoking. There was drug taking. And after I read this book and after I did research about Errol Flynn, I really came to the conclusion that from just listening to people write about him and talk about him and even reading some of his own words, I really think he was more scared about living a dull and boring life than he was about living a life that could possibly get him killed. He would rather die young and live hard and fast than, be an old grandpa on a rocking chair. He just wanted to live life and live life to the fullest. And if that meant he was going to die young and burn out, he just actually didn't care. And it just blows my mind, because I'm the type of person that lives very cautiously. I want to be safe. I do so much research. I want to make all the good choices. And this man just flew by the seat of his pants, didn't care, just literally woke up, and whatever he wanted to do, he just did it. And I wanted to share with you a quote from a documentary that I was watching. He had a biographer by the name of Tony Thomas, and this is what he said about Earl. He said, "It was like meeting a beautiful statue and then coming up close and seeing all the cracks and flaws. There was obviously a great sadness in this man. On the surface, he had everything. Here was an extraordinarily handsome man, an athlete. He had charm, wit, and intelligence. And yet somehow it didn't all add up to who he really wanted to be. When a man burns himself out by age 50, you have to think there are some great flaws there. There's something wrong." And I couldn't have said it better. There is so much in his backstory that made him into the man that he was to become. I really do feel that he was stunted in adolescence, and I don't really think he ever emotionally matured past the age of about 15, 16, and that's really how he conducted his life, literally crazed and by the seat of his pants. Errol Flynn would literally wake up on any given day of his life and just do whatever the hell he wanted to do, come hell or high water. It didn't matter. It didn't seem like it mattered if it was an illegal activity or if it was something that could possibly get him killed. It was just like, yeah, whatever. I want to sail halfway around the whole continent of Australia without any sailing experience. Sure, why not? I want to date a 17-year-old girl. Yeah, that sounds great. He did whatever the heck he wanted to. And I was actually shocked that the man lived to age 50. I mean, with the amount of partying and crazy living and risks that he took constantly, I am shocked that he didn't die at age 23. The amount of living that he did before the age of 25, before he even entered into Hollywood, is astounding. You could make a movie on Earl's life even before he got to Hollywood. And he really did believe that being a Hollywood actor was boring. He thought that was boring. He liked being outdoors and participating in sports and partying and going to war zones, being a war correspondent. To him, that was living. And to him, being a Hollywood movie star was constraining, and he just really wanted no part of it. So when he finally walked away from Hollywood, he actually didn't care at all. So he is super fascinating, super controversial, never boring. I cannot wait to get more into his life with you. But before we do that, before we get into the book and before we learn more about the superstar Errol Flynn and his infamous home, Mulholland Farm, I want to share with you a little ghost story. And this is actually how I stumbled onto Errol Flynn and learning about Mulholland Farm, and it was a really cool way to learn about it. It was like an onion that you were just peeling back all these layers of, and that's exactly what I wanted you guys to experience. So let's get into it. I was watching one of the classic episodes of Celebrity Ghost Stories, and they had Tracy Nelson on there. Now, Tracy Nelson is the daughter of the famous rock and roll singer Ricky Nelson. Rick Nelson rose to fame, literally grew up on television for 14 seasons on the show The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet, starring his own real-life parents, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, and his brother David. That show was on television from 1952 to 1966, 14 seasons. So he literally grew up on television in front of America. And when he got to be a teenager, he started as a rock and roll singer and really captured the hearts of millions of young American girls. And he was a wholesome rock star, and he wasn't as threatening to a lot of the older generation in the 50s and 60s, like say the way the Beatles or an Elvis Presley was. He was considered more wholesome, boy next door turned rock and roll singer. So it's 1980, and Rick Nelson has just bought Errol Flynn's home, Mulholland Farm. It was at 7740 Mulholland Drive. Now, the house known as Mulholland Farm was at the very tip top of the very long, winding road that is Mulholland Drive. And it's a very remote area. And it's an area of the San Fernando Mountains that overlooks the whole Los Angeles area. Rick Nelson was the third owner of Mulholland Farm. Now, Hollywood stars had been building their homes in the Hollywood Hills since the 1920s, but at the time that Mulholland Farm was built, it was different because it was so much more remote and it was so much more secluded, and that's just the way that Earl liked it. And it was on this spot in 1941 on 11.5 acres that Errol Flynn built Mulholland Farm, a 2-story colonial, which by all accounts, the house itself wasn't impressive, but the acreage was, and that's where he chose to build his sanctuary. And for 12 years, he did whatever the heck he wanted to. The house was known as Hollywood Party Central from 1941 to 1953. For 12 years, Earl played the dashing party host. Mulholland Farm was his castle, and he was the king. He just indulged himself and all of his wicked, wicked ways up at Mulholland Farm. And along with all of his buddies, including stars like David Niven, Humphrey Bogart, Frank Sinatra, John Barrymore, Peter O'Toole, they all held court up there and got into all kinds of hard partying and drinking and gambling and shenanigans. You name it, they did it up there. There was a pool. There were tennis courts. There was even a little building on the grounds that Earl called a casino that he would hold cockfights. And Earl was a notorious womanizer and playboy. Even though he was married 3 times, all he would do up there is entertain women. And Earl was notorious for not just being a womanizer, but being a voyeur as well. He had a bedroom at Mulholland Farm that had a two-way mirror as a ceiling. And you could go up into a crawl space in the attic above the bedroom and look down. And that's exactly what he would do with some of his buddies and cronies during all of these famous parties going on, look down at couples having sex in the bedrooms. He even had a little secret area behind the bar on the main floor that could look into one of the bathrooms, which was actually a ladies' bathroom. So a lot of sex, a lot of drugs, just a lot of just crazy debauchery. The party had to end sometime, and in 1953, Earl had to abandon and give up Mulholland Farm, and he basically fled America to go to Europe. He was trying to evade taxes, and he was also trying to avoid paying alimony. He was in default on alimony payments to his first wife, French actress Lily Demita. He was only married to her for about 7 years, and he said that he was paying for it for the rest of his life. So he had to abandon Mulholland Farm because he was so in debt, and he just hightailed it off to Europe. So by the time 1980 rolls around, Rick Nelson bought Mulholland Farm estate from the cowboy singer slash radio personality Stuart Hamblin. He was really famous in the 40s and 50s and apparently ran around with people like John Wayne and Ronald Reagan. Stuart had actually lived at Mulholland Farm for 20 years with his family. So when Rick moves in, he has his wife Kirsten, his daughter Tracy, his twin sons Matthew and Gunnar, and his youngest son Sam. I believe Tracy was 17 at the time, Matthew and Gunnar were 13, and Sam was 6. So I actually saw an interview with Gunnar Nelson on YouTube, and he was describing when he moved into the house with his twin brother Matthew when they were 13, along with his sister Tracy and his younger brother Sam. At that point, his parents had been married for about 17 years, but their marriage was really on the downslide. They were having a lot of problems, and he guesses that they bought that house kind of as their swan song, maybe that they were going to move into this new house and things in the marriage were going to change. But unfortunately, that wasn't meant to be, and Kirsten and Rick ended up divorcing in 1982. But Gunnar always described the house as being creepy, as being very remote. He said he felt always very isolated up there, especially when his dad was on the road and he would stay behind with his twin brother when he was older. He really felt like it was just always this very creepy vibe. And he even talks about when they first drove up to the house for the first time, when they were going to move in. He said that when he looked at the gates on the outside of the house, that it just reminded him of the Addams Family, these big, old, creepy, haunted looking gates. So it was always just like a really haunted vibe for the kids. So now we're in 1982 and Kirsten and Rick are now divorced. The twins and Sam have gone to live with Kirsten, and Tracy, who is now about 18, 19 at that time, she's working on a television show called Square Pegs. I don't know if you remember that show back from the 80s, Square Pegs, and she was living with her dad. However, her dad was on tour a lot of the time. He was trying to revitalize his music career, and he was getting some measure of success. That's why he was traveling so much. So when she was there, she spent a large amount of time alone in the house. Now, Tracy always described her time at Mulholland Farm as being creepy. She always talks about feeling very unsettled there. She said that shades and blinds would flip up by themselves. The shower door in her bathroom would always open and close. Her toilet would always flush, and she wasn't the one flushing it. She was always just noticing creepy things like that. And she said that she felt like the house didn't have a center. It didn't have a heart, but it did have a life of its own. And it was almost as if it didn't want her there. And she pretty much felt that way from the beginning. In fact, she said the very first night that she spent at Mulholland Farm, she had a dream, and she tells the story of this dream where she wakes up and she hears a party going on downstairs. So she gets up in her nightgown and walks down the stairs, and around the corner comes Errol Flynn himself. And he's handsome, he looks like he's in his heyday, he's wearing a tux, and he's holding a martini glass. And he holds it up to Tracy in a toast, and he says to her, "Happy New Year." Errol Flynn is toasting her, saying Happy New Year. And she says she always really felt like there was a party going on in the house, that there was some kind of life pulsating through the house. And it wasn't welcoming. It was just like this life that was existing outside of the people that were living there. So she just never felt like she got any rest. She never felt like she got any peace. She said she never really felt safe in the house, especially when she was alone. So her dad, Rick Nelson, gets this record contract to try to revitalize his music career, and she's spending a lot of time alone. And when her dad is at home, she's noticing her dad's doing a lot of partying. He's got some unsavory characters that always seem to be kind of hanging around, that always want something from him. She really feels like almost as if the house and the house's history is somehow affecting her dad in the present and the way that her dad is living his life. And that partying and a lot of that time on the road, that kind of evolves to then when her dad's at home, he's almost turning into a little bit of a depressive recluse when things aren't going as well in his music career as he would have liked. So either he's out on the road leaving her alone, or he's at home and he's spending time with these unsavory characters at the house, and she's just still feeling really unsettled, feeling like she doesn't really feel safe. She doesn't really feel like she belongs there. She really just wants to leave. And she even talks about how several times throughout this period where she says to her dad, "Hey Pop, I don't like this house. I don't like what's going on here. I just don't like the vibe. Let's just leave." But her dad is really enamored and in love with the idea of Mulholland Farm, and her dad really likes that he's living in Errol Flynn's old house. So she really feels like she had nowhere to go and kind of felt like she couldn't get her dad out of that situation. Tracy recounts an even more terrifying tale, and it's not even when she's asleep dreaming. It's something that happened to her when she was wide awake. She said that she was in her bedroom trying to sleep, and her dad was entertaining some people downstairs, kind of like a semi-party. And she said that she was laying in bed when she feels this immense weight on her chest, and she cannot move. It's like she's being pinned down. She can't breathe. She starts panicking, and while she's in this panic state, feeling this heaviness on her chest, she can't move. She hears this laughing. She hears what sounds like a man laughing, and she is just freaking out, paranoid. She finally pulls herself up out of the bed, pulls herself to the hallway, to the stairwell, and she's trying to get downstairs to where her dad is for help. She says she can't breathe. This whole time she feels like she's choking. She says she literally threw herself down the stairs. She's like crawling, and then she's calling for her dad, calling for her dad. Her dad comes around the corner, "What's going on? What's going on?" And she's saying, I can't breathe, and tell that man to stop laughing at me. And her dad's, "What man?" He has no idea what she's talking about. So all this crazy stuff is going on, and it's getting more and more bizarre, and it's getting more and more heightened. Tracy tells another story, which for her was the last straw and ended her stay at Mulholland Farm. She said one night she was driving home from the set of Square Pegs. She had worked a late night, and she says she's driving her car up the long, winding driveway to the house, and she sees into the dining room, and the lights are on. It's at night, and she sees a man walking back and forth in the dining room. So she's thinking, oh, Pop's home early from the road. She gets in the house, and there's no one there. So she's like, okay, goes up the stairs, does her nighttime routine a little bit later, and she hears all this commotion downstairs, this crashing and this banging. It sounds like there's practically an earthquake going on, and she hears most of the sounds right in the room below her, which is the room where her dad kept all of his gold records in these glass cases. And she describes what could only be the sound of a hammer hitting the glass cabinets. She hears glass shattering. It's the sound of furniture being toppled and overturned. She can hear like wood smashing, she said. She was just frightened out of her wits. So she doesn't know what to do. She's scared shitless. She doesn't want to go downstairs. She thought about going downstairs and running out of the house and escaping, but she's freaked out because she's thinking, okay, if I run down the stairs, I'm going to go right past the room where these burglars or robbers are. That room's right there. They're going to see me run out. Who the heck knows what's going to happen? So she's scared out of her mind, shaking like a leaf. So she ends up hiding in her bedroom closet for what seems like hours. So she's in the closet listening to all this commotion, wondering what the heck she's going to do. Eventually, the noise dies down. She stays in the closet for about a good hour until she can get the nerve up to get out of the closet and go downstairs and see what's going on. Once she gets down to the room where all the commotion was, the room is completely fine. It's pristine. Nothing is overturned. There's no glass broken. Nothing is out of place. Not one thing. It was at that moment where she's like, forget this crap. I've had enough. She calls her dad while he's on the road and she says, I'm out of here. This is what's going on. I can't take this anymore. Sorry, Pop, I'm out. So yeah, at that point, she is done. She has seen enough. She has heard enough. She feels like the house is just taken on a life of its own since she stepped foot in it. And by that point, she said the house was really decaying. Paint was peeling, screens were ripped, the lawn was overgrown. And a lot of times when her dad was there, again, he was just really depressed, wandering around in his bathrobe. His whole demeanor, his whole countenance was just spiraling downward. And she just really felt like the house was contributing to all of it. So she felt like she couldn't save her dad. He didn't want to leave, but she herself just really felt like she wasn't safe. She had to get out. So fast forward to 1985, Tracy is no longer living at Mulholland Farm, and Rick Nelson is still pursuing his musical career, finding some semblance of success, still doing a lot of touring and a lot of traveling. And because of this, he decides to buy a DC-3 plane built in 1944. He buys this plane from Jerry Lee Lewis, and Tracy tells the story that her whole family is just astounded that he would do this. He had apparently been afraid of flying his entire life, and he always had a certain set of rules about what types of planes he would get on and what types of planes he wouldn't. He always said, hey, only commercial, only big planes. He didn't want to get into any of these rickety old types of planes. So she said she found it just morbidly curious that he would, as someone who was scared of flying his whole life, then all of a sudden want to buy his own plane, and more than that, buy a plane that was really old and kind of rickety. And she said that he had a model of this DC-3 plane on his desk in his house that he would just sit at for hours and paint, a little mobile paint project. And she said it was just so bizarre, and the behavior, everything surrounding the plane and his fascination with the plane and this purchase of the plane was just bizarre and so unlike her dad. And pretty much since the time he bought it, the plane was plagued with mechanical problems. There was always things going wrong with the plane. The family wasn't too happy about this rickety plane. Tracy wasn't happy about the plane. They were all shocked, but they couldn't really do anything about it. Their dad had pretty much made up his mind, and he was traveling around in that thing. In her story, Tracy says that she was so upset about it, and she really felt like when her dad bought that plane, that he was kind of buying his ticket to the other side. She couldn't explain it, but that was just the full stop descent into madness for her dad. As it turns out, Tracy was right to be upset and suspicious and just overwrought with the fact that her dad bought that plane in the first place, because on December 31st, 1985, her dad would die in that very plane on New Year's Eve en route to Dallas for a New Year's Eve concert. He was 45 years old and traveling with his then fiancée and 5 band members. They all perished. The 2 pilots, however, survived. So she hears the devastating news about her father dying in this plane crash on New Year's Eve. And her immediate response is to harken back to that dream she had the very first night that she spent at the house in Mulholland Farm, when she goes down the stairs and around the corner, in a tuxedo, looking handsome and dashing, is Errol Flynn, holding a glass up to her saying, "Happy New Year." I can only imagine what that must feel like, and then to have your father die on New Year's Eve. Yeah. So what do you guys think of that story? I personally have had some experience with paranormal activity, although I don't necessarily believe in ghosts so much as I believe in demonic activity. I feel like people are either in heaven or in the other place. If they are on earth, they're there because God is permitting it. But anything else that you might see or hear, I personally believe is demonic. I believe you don't mess with that type of thing. You don't try to talk to it. You don't try to communicate with it. Is it the ghost of Errol Flynn? I don't know. Could it possibly be a demon impersonating Errol Flynn? Maybe. But yeah, so all very, very scary, very, very frightening. I felt awful for Tracy hearing that story. And I remember when Ricky Nelson died, and I remember at my aunt's house at a New Year's party, crying with my cousin when we learned the news, because I remember watching Ozzie and Harriet when I was a little kid, black and white reruns on television. And growing up in the 80s, when people talked about listening to oldies, they were talking about listening to music from the 50s and 60s. So I was very familiar with Rick Nelson and his music. So after that happened, I just remember feeling so sad that Ricky Nelson died. And then to learn years later the backstory about how he left 4 children, and then to find out about everything going on in the house that he lived in, everything that went on with his eldest daughter and that dream she had, and how it all tied into his tragic New Year's Eve death. Just very, very freaky. So in that episode of Celebrity Ghost Stories that I watched, Tracy talks about how the house mysteriously burned down one night. But in my research, I found out that the entirety of the house didn't burn. It was only a part of the house. That the house itself that Earl built in 1941, that was known as Mulholland Farm, was actually leveled to the ground in 1988 by real estate developers. So after Rick Nelson died in that tragic plane crash in 1985, the house was sold to those developers, and 3 years later, they demolished it. And what they ended up doing to the 11.5 acres was they parceled it out and sold that. So there were different homes built on that area. At one point, the actress Helen Hunt had built on the very same area that Mulholland Farm was on. She built a mansion that she apparently never moved into, and eventually sold to Justin Timberlake and Jessica Biel, who owned the home up until about 2021. And at one point, Justin had put that mansion on the market in 2021 for about $21 million, but then the listing was removed. So whether it was sold or kept, we don't know. There is no record of there being a new owner. So this was the story that got me really curious to want to find out more about this crazed magnetic man known as Errol Flynn and the home that he built called Mulholland Farm. What do you guys think of that story? Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in that type of activity? I think there are a lot more people that believe in ghosts that don't believe in ghosts, frankly. And this book is great, you guys. It's part biography and it's part historical accounts of the house itself. It goes into its history and everything that happened in this house. I can't wait to get into this book with you, you guys. It is going to be a good one. I hope you enjoyed this introduction. I hope it got you excited for the book Errol Flynn Slept Here. I can't wait for you to join me as we get into the book. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I appreciate you so much, and I will talk to you very, very soon. Bye.